I'm Mary Lou Finley.
And I'm Rick McInnes-Ray. Thank you for joining us with our ongoing live coverage of the suicide bombings in the United States today. We are getting word at this point that there are explosions in Kabul. There are fires burning. Pictures are being carried live. It's not clear why, but there are indications which came out of Washington just a little earlier this afternoon from U.S. officials speaking on background, on condition of anonymity, that there were what they call unspecified indications the organization of Osama bin Laden may have had something to do with today's suicide attacks. And he, of course, has had considerable assistance from the Taliban in Afghanistan. Again, this is an official on background, but the fact of the matter is there are fires burning in Kabul right now as we speak, rockets soaring overhead, but it's unclear who's doing the shooting or why.
Perhaps suggesting that some in the administration have decided who is behind the terrorist attacks today. We're trying to get through to our correspondent in Washington at the moment, but we also have Frank Koller on the line now, still driving towards New York City. Frank, can we hear you better this time?
Yeah, I hope so, Mary Lou. Good afternoon again. I'm standing actually on the grounds of a schoolyard in Elizabeth, New Jersey, looking down at the towers of Manhattan. The flags actually in this schoolyard have been put at half-staff. As we talked about half an hour ago, there's a huge new and expanding cloud of smoke emanating from the site across the river from me in Manhattan. It changed quite dramatically about 20 past the last hour from a dark gray to a much lighter color, and that's at the point I think we faded out when I was driving. That local radio indicated, and then you indicated as well, that another of the relatively smaller towers had collapsed and was burning, and that's the scene that I'm looking at now from across the river in New Jersey.
We were told earlier that bridges and tunnels out of Manhattan were closed. Are there people leaving now, or what is the traffic scene?
The traffic scene is absolutely horrendous, although I've just passed the cordon in downtown Elizabeth where no cars can go further, only cars can leave, and I'm trying to walk at this point to get to the waterfront so that I can see a little more clearly. And the streets here in Elizabeth, New Jersey are now, Jersey City rather, my apologies, are very, very quiet now.
What are the conversations of the people that you do here?
The conversations people are, I'm sorry, there's a bus going by, my apologies. The conversations that I've overheard are just people talking about how amazed they are. It's such, this part of New Jersey has a bird's eye view, and people are standing at the schoolyard just looking over with binoculars. Some people are taking pictures. It's the kind of thing you just can't ever imagine happening, and people are talking about that. One man walking along behind me, talking to another young woman, asking about somebody's mother, who apparently was not in Manhattan today, and it's obviously just transfixed this community.
The city that used to be identified on a television show as the city of 8 million souls, you think of the numbers of people around the United States and around the world indeed who know people or who are related to people working and living in New York. They must all still be trying to ensure, they must be hoping that their loved ones are safe.
I'm sure. We stopped on the interstate when I was driving up here with the taxi cab, and there was a woman who pulled in just ahead of me heading for New York, and as I mentioned earlier, the interstate was absolutely empty coming into New York City, gassing up and buying a coffee. I chatted with her for a moment. She had just flown down to Washington for the day. Her husband was actually in the first World Trade Center. He was on the 60th floor, I think she said. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, he was able to get out very quickly, and she has been in contact with him, but she was shaking, understandably, and trying to make her way back to the city.
All right, Frank, we're going to go to Washington. As we said a few moments ago, there are pictures of explosions in Kabul. We're going to see if we can learn anything more about that. We'll talk to you later. Thank you.
Okay, Mary Lou.
Laura Lynch is our correspondent in Washington. Laura, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Rick.
Are you seeing what we're hearing and seeing in Kabul?
Yes, I am. I'm seeing the explosions and hearing about them and wondering where they're coming from, because they certainly do seem to be coincident with the return of President Bush to Washington and his expected address to the nation within a few hours.
I'm going to hold you up there for just a second. We have Jonathan Harley in Afghanistan. Could you spare with us just a moment? Jonathan, can you hear me and tell us what's going on there?
Okay, I'm standing at the edge of town in the Hotel Intercontinental. As I look across the Afghan capital, Kabul, we've been seeing explosions in the last 10 or 15 minutes or so across the horizon. They seem to be targeted artillery of sorts, which appear to be coming from a very high-flying plane. They may even be targeting the airport. It's not clear at this stage exactly where they're aiming at, or indeed where they're coming from. But extremely dramatic and concerning scenes here in the Afghan capital, and signs that this incredible incident is escalating in an extremely serious way.
I mean, are you able to tell how many missiles there were? Do they appear to be what people expect, cruise missiles, perhaps?
Look, I think we're talking in the vicinity of about a dozen.
Is this a common event to see any missile fire in Afghanistan? There is still much of a war going on there, after all.
There is a civil war still going on, but there hasn't been shelling of Kabul for the last couple of years, so it would be an incredible coincidence if it was related to the civil war.
Jonathan, are the local media doing or saying anything, reporting any of this?
Well, it's only just broken in the last couple of minutes, and the local media, of course, is state-controlled. It's 2:30 in the morning here. There's a curfew which is imposed at 11 o'clock every night. So we can't expect anything from the local media at the moment.
If this were any kind of retaliation for what happened today in the United States, where would the likely targets be in Kabul?
Well, in Kabul, that's a good question. Obviously, the airport would be one obvious one, but the problem with that is that the airport's also used for humanitarian operations by the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Other targets beyond Kabul would be the suspected bases of the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden in Jalalabad, perhaps to the where east of here, and down in Kandahar, the southern Taliban stronghold where Osama bin Laden is in hiding.
Jonathan, the Taliban have said already today that they know nothing of what happened in America. They don't have any hand in it. Can we take that at face value?
Well, I don't think it'll be. I think it'll come as cold comfort to many people who are putting the accusatory finger at the Taliban and at Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is wanted by Washington for alleged terrorist activities, the bombing of the American embassies in Africa 3 years ago now, in which 220 people died, the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, where 7 people died. He is Washington's public enemy number one, and the Taliban has had him as a guest for the last 3 years or so in exchange for his support in their fight in the civil war. So I think that the Taliban's remarks earlier this evening local time won't be taken on face value, no.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan Harley is a journalist in Afghanistan tonight, and from Afghanistan, let's go back to Washington. Meredith?
Yes, where we're joined by CBC correspondents Laura Lynch and Jennifer Westaway. Does either of you have anything to report, any Jen, on what's happening in Afghanistan?
Oh, Mary Lou, it's Laura Lynch here. If you look at the timing of all of this, President Bush had a teleconference call with members of his top national security advisors. He was in Nebraska at that point. That may have been within the last couple of hours or so, and now you see these bombs falling in Afghanistan. Is it retaliation for a suspected attack by Osama bin Laden? Well, we will probably find that out sometime in the next few hours. President Bush is expected to address the nation within about approximately 3 hours. There are reports that other members of his cabinet, Attorney General John Ashcroft, perhaps others, will also give brief statements to the nation, perhaps within the hour as well. And then we will start to find out whether this was indeed retaliation for the attacks in New York and here in Washington.
I suppose that it's hard to get any information from your usual sources, since most of the government has been sequestered in some vault or other since the attacks this morning.
We have, as you know, we haven't seen very much of anyone in government. We've seen President Bush appear before the cameras briefly twice, first this morning in Sarasota and then later in the day at an Air Force base in Louisiana. He hasn't been seen since then. Vice President Cheney is in a secure area of the White House. Other members of cabinet are in secure areas around the city, but they are all apparently President Bush is returning to Washington and will be here later this evening to talk to Americans.
We've heard a fair bit about American warships being moved around, being moved closer to American shores, but does anybody know if the Americans have any warships, perhaps cruise missile equipped, standing off close enough to hit Afghanistan?
I am not aware of any of that. Now, you know that within the last few months there have been efforts to keep American ships in the Gulf well out from land after previous attacks on ships in the Gulf.
Right.
Where they are positioned at this moment, I can't say.
You know, I should remind listeners who may have just joined us, London is quite a center for Arab dissidents and Arab newspapers, and one of the more credible ones there is Al-Quds, which says that some weeks ago it was alerted, as it often is, but alerted to what it called a huge and unprecedented attack, but nothing specific, according to Abdel Bari Atwan, who is the editor there. Has there been anything made of this report at all in Washington?
Rick, I haven't seen anything talked about on that particular point. There's been an awful lot of speculation going on in the last few hours, as you know, about the operations of Osama bin Laden and how extensive his network is, along with the denials from Afghanistan that he could have had any involvement in this. The thing we're having to wait for at this point is the official word from someone in government on exactly what they believe has happened.
Jennifer, we had heard some officials or former officials earlier in the day in the United States calling this an act of war. What is the feeling there at the moment?
Well, I've spent the day on the streets of Washington, D.C., and at the moment the streets of Washington, D.C. are very empty ones. The people themselves who were wandering around earlier in the day just trying to get out of downtown weren't talking war, they were talking terrorism. They weren't thinking that this was something that was going to be an all-out military operation on the part of their government. They were just looking for ways to be safe. Now, I suspect as the hours go by and if we find out what's really been going on in Kabul, we might end up with something that sounds a little bit more like America at war, but people were very stunned today. They really didn't know how to process what had happened. The sheer magnitude of the number of people who have died in New York, that people just couldn't get their heads around it. We had some tape from earlier in the day of people trying to process the information.
It's crazy. I've never seen a city like this before. It was devastating. It really was. People were just out here, the cars every which way, people moving so quickly and whatnot. It's terrible when I came out the building today.
That's from earlier in the day, Mary Lou, when people were trying to get through traffic jams and they had been evacuated out of federal buildings, and once they were evacuated, they then weren't allowed to go back in and get their cars. So the traffic jams went on for some hours before they could get the people and all the traffic up, out, and into the suburbs and have what is now a very empty downtown core.
All right, Laura Lynch and Jennifer Westaway, thank you very much. We'll be talking to you later, I'm sure, in Washington. And Rick, Anthony Germain, I think, is in Ottawa and standing by now.
Yes, I hope so. Hello, Anthony, are you there?
Yes.
Can you bring us up to speed on the Canadian side of events happening in the U.S. and around the world today?
Well, amidst a tense atmosphere, given the astonishing events in New York and Washington, there really was what amounted to an evacuation of Parliament Hill. At first, there was an evacuation of the East Block, which is a building which contains mostly Senate offices, but there was a police operation to investigate a van that was parked on the outside. Turned out to be nothing serious, but in this sort of climate of anxiety caused by the terrorism in the United States, taking no precautions, most parliamentary staff were told just to go home. So by mid-afternoon, really Ottawa, the nation's capital, was quite empty in the downtown area. The Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, was meeting with Saskatchewan Premier Lorne Calvert at 24 Sussex Drive this morning when one of his aides knocked on the door, had something important to say, and informed him of what happened. Now, at first, the Prime Minister put out a written statement condemning what had happened as an act of cowardice, but as the day unfolded, he was really forced to meet with reporters outside the lobby of the House of Commons.
The RCMP Commission.
Well, that's what happened this morning. For the security, I have been in touch with the ministers and with the head of the agencies to make sure that everything was to remain secure, and we said to everybody to remain calm. I hope that Canadians will show their solidarity with our neighbors and the news to come, when we discover the number of people who died, will be probably very tragic.
So as Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, Rick, you were mentioning the RCMP's Commissioner, Giuliano Zaccardelli?
Yes, indeed. If anybody had any questions about what once was live radio, they now know for sure. The RCMP Commissioner was at the microphone. What security issues does he say we have or do not face or do face tonight?
Well, Rick, I think given the fact that very few cabinet ministers, in fact, none to my knowledge, spoke today about what was going on, I'm talking about the ministers whose departments would be directly involved, there was a bit of pressure, I suspect, on the RCMP to talk about security operations. Now, as with national defense, Zaccardelli was not specific, but he did allude to the fact that there has been an increase in security operations across the country.
We have instituted a number of measures to protect the citizens of this country, certain institutions, certain buildings, and certain people that are potentially at higher risk. That's what we have done.
And Rick, that would include the American Embassy here in Ottawa, which is known certainly in the capital as being a fortress already, with its own contingent of Marines providing security on the inside, but also with extra RCMP cruisers on the outside, 24 Sussex Drive, where the U.S. Embassy is located, as is the Prime Minister's residence, and similar security precautions being taken at U.S. installations, I'm thinking consular offices, for instance, across the country.
You know, I remember the RCMP Commissioner saying the Americans have asked us for certain things, did he? And I know he's not going to tell us exactly what he meant, but I want you to tell us what you think he meant.
Well, there'll be a number of, one of the reasons that they would be very reluctant, as are people in national defense, to talk about specific actions in terms of the increase of security, is because we would be talking about, for example, the residence of the ambassador of the United States. We'd be talking about key employees for the various American businesses that might be anywhere between Montreal and Bay Street. We don't exactly know those locations, but important Americans who happen to be here on business would be people to be under consideration. Even I would dare say the RCMP are probably involved at the film festival in Toronto, where movie stars from the United States are at. When something of this magnitude happens, the RCMP basically meets with CSIS and the National Defense someplace in Ottawa and tries to pinpoint, okay, what's going on in Canada, and if something's going to happen, where is it likely to happen? And from there, who knows what they would decide to beef up.
Anthony, it's Mary Lou. I just wanted to know whether the Prime Minister has said whether he's spoken to President Bush today.
Well, it's interesting you asked that, Mary Lou, because it became pretty obvious by the American coverage that at one point during the day, President Bush was basically circling in the air in Air Force One, and it was reported then that he was conferring with world leaders. It's pretty clear that Jean Chrétien, to the best of our knowledge at this hour, had not spoken to President Bush. When he met with reporters today, the Prime Minister said he had spoken with American authorities, and he also expressed a desire at that time to eventually speak with President Bush, and I think Mr. Chrétien said he'd like to try to do that sometime tonight.
All right, well, maybe we'll be speaking to you later tonight. Is the Prime Minister expected to speak again?
Nothing has been scheduled. His office says that there'll be nothing. There's no cabinet meeting, no extra special cabinet meeting today or tomorrow. And there will probably be a statement from David Collinette, the Transport Minister. Collinette's department under a lot of strain. They're the ones who are dealing with relocating American flights that were all rerouted to Canada. So we can expect a statement from the Transport Minister, but not the Prime Minister.
All right, Anthony Germain in Ottawa. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
As we have mentioned, in the past half hour, there have been explosions, missiles over Kabul, Afghanistan. We know a little more than that. We don't know who's doing the firing or why. But that said, I will tell you that U.S. President George Bush is to make a televised address to the American people shortly. He'll speak about 2.5 hours from now at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Now, earlier in the day, he was taken by plane to a military base in Nebraska as the U.S. went on high alert. Today's attacks are the worst in history on the U.S. mainland. They're being compared with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The day began with 2 suicide planes striking the World Trade Center in New York. Both buildings later collapsed at a time when thousands of people were in them at work. Hundreds have been wounded that we know of, but New York's Mayor Rudolph Giuliani fears a horrendous loss of life. Now, the attacks shut down all airline traffic across the United States and Canada. Many international flights that were headed for the U.S. have been diverted to airports here, and there have been numerous reports of passengers on board the hijacked airliners calling for help on their cell phones. One of those who phoned out was Barbara Olson, the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. She was on a jet that crashed into the Pentagon. CNN's Tim O'Brien picks up that story.
Our understanding is that Barbara Olson was on the plane, a frequent commentator on CNN and the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson. She called her husband twice during the hijacking to tell him the plane had been hijacked. And they lost contact once, and she called back. After the first call, Olson called the command center at the Justice Department to inform them of this hijacking, and they said they knew nothing about it but would track it down. Barbara Olson told Ted the following story, that all the passengers were herded to the back of the plane, including the flight personnel, including the pilot. And the only weapons she mentioned were knives and cardboard cutters. You would think if there were a machine gun or any other kind of gun that she would have mentioned that. But the only weapons she mentioned were knives and cardboard cutters. I asked Ted if she made any reference to nationality of the hijackers or any suspicions about the motive. And he said she made no reference to that at all. They didn't have a whole lot of time to talk. She said to Ted, "What do I tell the pilot to do?" Somewhat typical of Barbara, a take-charge kind of person. But there was nothing they could do, and they're all trapped in the back of the plane.
And in a tragic twist of fate, Barbara Olson was supposed to leave Washington yesterday. But she decided to stay until this morning so she could have breakfast with her husband and celebrate his birthday. In Washington tonight, the fires are still burning, and at the Pentagon, Mike Walter saw the crash this morning and describes what happened.
I was heading northbound on 27, and the traffic this morning, it was, a typical rush hour, had ground to a standstill, and I looked off, looked out my window, I saw this plane, a jet, American Airlines jet coming, and I thought, this doesn't add up, it's really low, and I saw it just went, it was like a cruise missile with wings, went right there and slammed right into the Pentagon. Huge explosion, great ball of fire, and smoke started billowing out, and then there was just chaos on the highway as people either tried to move around the traffic and go down either forward or backwards. We had a lady who was in front of me who was backing up and screaming, "Everybody go back, they've hit the Pentagon." And I got to tell you, I got out and walked over, and I saw parts of the plane. The debris was actually on the overpass there. And I watched as this military personnel just came running out with stretchers and tarps and set up a triage unit. And I just couldn't help but feel for these guys. Those are their friends and comrades in there, and yet they immediately jumped into action. It was unbelievable to watch. And the toughest thing for me right now is I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and a lot of her friends have parents who work in the Pentagon. And I just talked to her on the phone, and those kids are going through agony tonight. They don't know if they're okay.
A witness to the crash at the Pentagon, Mike Walter. Now, Prime Minister Chrétien was among the first world leaders to react to the attacks. He says it's impossible to fully comprehend the evil that would lead to such a cowardly assault on innocent people. He's offered any assistance Canada can provide to our American friends. In Israel, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon says his country will hold a national day of mourning tomorrow to show solidarity with the American people. Meanwhile, a senior Palestinian official...
This is Radio Canada International, Canada's voice to the world, broadcasting to the United States. Coming up on 6175, 9590, 9755, 13670, and 17695 kilohertz, as it happens, from our national public broadcaster, CBC Radio.
I'm Rick McInnes-Ray.
I'm Mary Lou Finley. Welcome back to our special coverage of the World Trade Center bombing or attack by suicide airplanes that were hijacked this morning in New York City. We're going to have a brief recap now of the sounds and events of today. Before we go there, I just want to say that CNN is reporting that the United States administration has now said that the explosions in Kabul are not part of any U.S. military response to today's events. Now, here are some of the sounds from today's events that have happened.
There's smoke billowing out of the World Trade Center.
I just saw a second plane come in from the south. People just kept jumping and jumping and jumping, and you could still see they were alive because they were flailing around.
It's a huge plume of smoke which continues to rise from the west side of the Pentagon.
I hope I live. She's coming down on me. Here it comes.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
We're joined now by Simon Reeve, author of The New Jackals, Ramzi Youssef, Osama bin Laden, and the Future of Terrorism. Mr. Reeve, we just heard President George W. Bush speaking about a faceless coward. Is it possible to put a face on the person or persons responsible for what happened today?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think eventually they're all individuals. It's just very difficult at the moment to know who the people behind them are. I mean, obviously, Osama bin Laden is being mentioned as the likeliest suspect, and he's certainly at the top of a very short list of people likely to have been able to pull this sort of attack together.
Well, people always say, who else would have the resources? I mean, is that the case?
I think it is essentially. I mean, you would need to have a large terrorist organisation or a state such as Iraq. Only they would be capable of marshalling the necessary resources, making the preparations for this type of atrocity.
But what is there to indicate that it is not a state?
Well, I think we're still learning what on earth is going on. I mean, there's nothing immediately to suggest it couldn't be Iraq. It may be, it's possible, but I personally think it's more likely to have been bin Laden.
All right, talk for a moment about Ramzi Youssef. He was the person held responsible for the World Trade Center bombing in February 1993.
Indeed he was. He's in jail now in Colorado. He's described as perhaps the most secure prisoner in the American penal system. He was the mastermind behind the 1993 bombing. His aim in that was to topple one of the Twin Towers into the other. He failed largely because he didn't have enough explosives and because the bomb was placed by the wrong support columns. But the attempt was there. I mean, as I say, an attempt was made to topple one of the towers. It failed then, but it looks as though an attack today has succeeded with tragic results, obviously.
And his organization, he was connected to bin Laden?
Ramzi Youssef was one of the first soldiers that bin Laden sent against the West. He wasn't directly linked with bin Laden, but bin Laden provided backing and may have suggested the target to Youssef. Obviously it has huge symbolic value. The Twin Towers dominating America, a symbol of American power and influence. And perhaps the situation was that they failed in 1993, so they've had another go today.
Did bin Laden take responsibility or claim responsibility of the 93 bombing?
No, he's denied it, but then he has denied several of the attacks that he's been quite closely linked with. He is held by the American intelligence agencies and by Pakistani intelligence. They accuse him of being involved in the World Trade Center bombing.
The Taliban officials today said that it would have been impossible for bin Laden to have organized this attack. Is their word to be taken?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, they would say that, really, wouldn't they? I mean, they don't want America to launch any more attacks against them or impose more sanctions and so on. I mean, certainly the Taliban are supposed to have got bin Laden under lock and key almost and preventing him from having regular communication with his supporters, but That's not believed to stop him from resorting to the Stone Age and actually talking to people, just receiving emissaries, discussing things with them, and then sending them off. It's possible that this attack has been launched by people who support Osama bin Laden, rather than people who are actually followers of his, rather than his actual sort of terrorist troops, as you might say. In many ways, bin Laden has become something of a cult figure as much as a terrorist leader, and people do seem to be committing terrorist atrocities, being inspired by him rather than being actually commanded to go on the attack.
But again, with considerable resources and planning.
Considerable resources, but in truth, these type of acts, we may find that this doesn't take that many resources. It just takes preparation, an element of planning, and the willingness for an individual to give their life in the pursuit of this type of goal.
All right, Mr. Reeve, thank you very much for talking to us tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Simon Reeve is the author of The New Jackals, a recently released book about Ramzi Youssef and Osama bin Laden and the future of terrorism. Rick.
I want to continue for just a moment trying to look inside the nature and shape of terrorist groups operating around the world. And to that end, we're joined now by Edward Peck from his home in Bethesda. Now, Mr. Peck is a former U.S. ambassador to Iraq. He's also a former member of the President's Task Force on Combating Terrorism under Ronald Reagan. He worked directly with President George Bush Sr. While he was in office. And this morning, coincidentally, when the attack occurred, he was meeting with heads of 7 Middle East groups. Now, coincidence or not, the subject was terrorism. Mr. Peck, welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Did anything about that meeting this morning anticipate what happened today?
Well, the meeting wasn't really about terrorism. These are groups that are dedicated to the prospects of trying to find peace and work out various issues. There were also some humanitarian groups. We were just sitting here talking about, we get together from time to time to talk about what should be done to help solve some of the problems. And the attack took place while we were meeting, and the meeting immediately broke up as we all rushed off to take care of our various activities. But the terrorism was not the issue of what we were talking about at the time.
Let me ask you if you could address the question of why now? Why today? Why now?
Well, we've been looking for some significance in the date, and I haven't found one, but then I'm not a historian, so I don't know what the purpose is, but this has clearly been brewing for a long time. Well, one of the really painful things in the midst of all of this horror is to try to figure out, what is it that causes people to hate us this much? And nobody really wants to talk about that. We didn't want to talk about it before the events transpired, and we certainly want to talk about them less now. But if you don't address that very painful subject, then you're never going to find your way out of the box, in my view.
And to some, is it possible the U.S. has perceived itself as a terrorist organization?
Well, many people see us that way, without wishing to put too fine a point on it. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, because whether or not something is right or wrong depends entirely upon whom you ask. So that Ramzi Youssef, when he made his statement to the court, I heard his name mentioned by Mr. Reeve just a few moments ago. Well, Ramzi Youssef's statement to the court at the time of his conviction made it clear that in his mind, the biggest terrorists around were the government of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean he's right, but perceptions don't have to be correct. Perceptions are perceptions. That's what they're all about. And there are an awful lot of people out there who perceive the United States as being a threat to their safety, security, future, whatever. I don't happen to agree with them. That has to be clear. But as long as they feel that way, there's going to be a problem. And so, in the same sense that we in America, you in Canada and other parts of the world, try to figure out what causes urban unrest or, the collapse of companies or gangs or the use of drugs, and we look at the causes of these things, you probably ought to spend a little bit of time trying to focus on why is it that they perceive us so far away as a serious threat to their security, future, and well-being.
Well, earlier Mr. Reeve also suggested that it could be Iraq behind this, could be someone else, but let me ask you, as a former American ambassador to Iraq, what would be in it for Iraq to be involved in this at all now?
Well, just for one thing, it could easily be revenge because from their point of view, the United States, and this is a view which is painfully shared by a lot of other people, the United States has caused enormous suffering and, horrifying numbers of deaths amongst the Iraqi people with our single-minded pursuit of getting rid of Saddam. And the mechanism we have chosen to use is the embargo, which, merely to use an Americanism, sticks it to the Iraqi people, not to Saddam Hussein. And by our own statutes, by our own U.S. laws, that's terrorism, as defined. So his idea, and I'm not saying that he did it. The nice thing about Saddam Hussein, he's very convenient for the Americans. We can blame him for everything, male pattern baldness, the outbreak of West Nile fever, whatever, because there he is as the man we love to hate. And that doesn't make him a nice guy or a bad guy, either one, but so Mr. Reeves says it could be Saddam Hussein. Well, yeah, it could be the Japanese Red Army.
Well, based on your inner knowledge of the workings of the various groups in the Middle East, how many of them, who among them could mount this kind of operation? Or is it even that complicated?
Sure, that's a tough one. The person who had the handle on an answer to that question would have been able perhaps to have, have prevented it, because, this is an incredibly complicated, sophisticated, shatteringly effective blow against us. Who's going to want to board an airplane tomorrow? The city of Washington, on the edges of which I live, is shut down. They've closed the schools, the universities, the offices, and everybody's run. That's a ghastly, but incredibly effective attack against the United States.
Well, the thing of it, too, is that your government knows where the training camps are. Hell, I know where they are. And you don't even need to pick up half a dozen available books in the public market, and you'll all know where they are. And yet, it still got through. It still happened.
Well, we don't know whether those training camps had anything to do with it or not. It's, and the other problem is, of course, that based upon our own law, you can't just rush out there. You remember not too long ago, we bombed that weapons factory in the Sudan, which turned out, and the Pentagon admitted, was a pharmaceutical plant.
Yes.
Okay, the oops. So that the idea is you've got to have it, you're supposed to have good, solid, incontrovertible evidence that this is this and that is that. Training camps run around, do all sorts of things, but I'm interested in hearing on your show that the United States has said that we have nothing to do with what's happening in Kabul, which is interesting to know.
It is indeed, and we may know that a little bit more now, sir. I'm going to have to stop you there, because in the U.S., Senator John Warner with the Armed Services Committee is on his feet.
In America's history. And yet I think it can be its finest hour, as our president and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act. A series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on the situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication with them the world over.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few questions and then we'll adjourn. Charlie.
Mr. Secretary, did you have any inkling at all, in any way, that something of this nature and something of this scope might be planned?
Charlie, we don't discuss intelligence matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Yes. We are getting reports from CNN and others that there are bombs
exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld now.
In no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
Mr. Secretary, you said you could not be specific about casualties. Can you give us some characterization of whether it's dozens, hundreds in the building?
Well, we know there were large number, many dozens in the aircraft that flew at full power, steering directly into between I think the first and second floor of the opposite the helipad. You've seen it. There cannot be any survivors. It just would be beyond comprehension. There are a number of people that they've not identified by name, but identified as being dead, and there are a number of casualties. But the FBI has secured the site, and the information takes time to come. People have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
Could you tell us what you saw?
Mr. Secretary, do you consider what happened today, both in New York and here, an act of war?
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, a massive attack against the United States of America. What words the lawyers will use to characterize it is for them.
Does that mean that the U.S. is at war then?
Mr. Secretary, you said that the Pentagon would be open for business tomorrow. What kind of assurances can you give the people who work here at the building that the building will be safe?
A terrorist can attack at any time, at any place, using any technique. It is physically impossible to defend at every time, in every place, against every technique. It is not possible to give guarantees. The people who work in this building do so voluntarily. They're brave people, and they do their jobs well.
Mr. Secretary, can you give a sense of what happened? What did you see when you left your office, ran down to the site, and apparently helped people on stretchers and returned to the command center?
That was U.S. Secretary of State Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, briefing reporters at the Pentagon. We have in our studio now Barbara McDougall, former Foreign Affairs Minister in Ottawa, when I think it was External Affairs.
Yeah.
Barbara, just first of all, your reactions. Did you ever imagine that you would see a day like this?
No, I don't think anyone did. And like everyone else, I've spent the day sort of holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know, you keep wondering what else is out there, and it's very easy to lose confidence in all of the systems that we have in the Western world to look after ourselves. And I think that's reflected in people in the street. I was in downtown Toronto today, and the financial district, of course, was closed, and there were police everywhere in our financial district. But this was a very targeted attack, and I think that if there is something further, and the Americans clearly aren't ruling this out, and we shouldn't either, but I think this is very much targeted towards the U.S.
From your knowledge of government and cabinet and whatnot, what is the Canadian cabinet doing tonight, and what should it be
Well, it's probably
addressing?
trying to meet and not having much luck because ministers none of them are in town. The Prime Minister will be, no doubt, if not meeting with, certainly in touch with all of his senior people, including CSIS and the military and the Department of Defense and so on, and to be told what measures all of our institutions are taking, including the RCMP, and even probably what some private companies are doing, bus companies and so on, because that could well be a target.
Is there any reason to believe that there would be Canadian targets as well, or are they worried about American targets in Ottawa and Toronto?
They would worry about American targets probably in Ottawa and Toronto, but it's up to the government, any government,
One of its first and most important responsibilities is to physically protect its population. And so every government tonight, I think, will be looking at their own systems and so on. And other countries are much more used to this than we are. We've never had a war fought on our soil. We've had very few attacks of any kind as compared with the IRA in Britain and in France, for example, there have been terrorist attacks, and in Germany for various reasons, in the United States.
Our only experience was the FLQ. Even the Fenians, I mean.
Yes. And so you'd have to go back an awfully long way to find anything on our soil. I think that's an extra reason why Canadians are in shock. This is not believable for Canadians, and I don't think it's yet hit and what has actually happened. Also, there will be a lot of people in Canada who have dealings with the 150 companies that are in these buildings, and they will have personal acquaintances and so on. And our relationship with the U.S. is so close that I think people do feel almost as though they're a part of the attack.
What is your feeling about the speculation today as to who's responsible for this attack, and tell me what you think the response might be?
I think the Americans will respond vigorously once they know who it is, or once they have a good idea of who it is. I don't think they're going to wait for a lot of nuances. Terrorism, unfortunately, does not respond to turning the other cheek. Retaliation is almost the only route that you have, and even though retaliation may lead to more retaliation, and you up the ante every time you retaliate, if you don't do something, then it will embolden whoever these groups are. I think the speculation is probably fairly close. Because of the sophistication, because of the time it takes to plan something like this, because of these suicide bombings, and there are only certain organizations in the world which perform this kind of suicidal attack. So I think they will have a pretty short list of where these people come from.
And because it's the World Trade Center again?
Well, yes, probably that will enter into it, but it's such an obvious target, I think, for anyone, who would do this. And is it a copycat? Yes, but it still has to be someone who, your previous guest was talking about, who hates us that much, and that shortens the list somewhat too.
Governor Mario Cuomo today earlier was speaking about the need not to become uncivilized in response. Not to forget who we are and to keep our democratic institutions, but he also said we are changed forever today.
Yes, I think the whole Western world has changed forever today, and particularly the United States. I don't think we should have an uncivilized response, or that the Americans should have an uncivilized response. But does that mean you don't retaliate? I don't think necessarily. I think what we have to be sure that we all do in Canada as well as in the U.S. is not label entire groups, entire ethnic groups, entire religions, entire populations. This is the work of fanatics. I'm one of those who's not afraid to say that it is an act of war. And I think that it's funny, there were two Muslim women waiting for bus tonight as I was driving downtown, and I almost stopped and offered them a ride. I mean, they must feel very frightened and very vulnerable, and ordinary people should not be attacked in any way, either verbally or any other way.
It'll be a long time before we feel safe again, perhaps, even here.
Even here. And, we've had this wide open border for so long, and I think it's a long time. It's going to be a long time before we have this undefended border again, because both the Mexican border and the Canadian border bleed into the U.S., and I think they're going to get much tougher.
We've been trying so hard to keep ours open and the Mexicans to make theirs freer. That's not going to happen for a while, I guess. Thank you very much for coming by this evening, Barbara McDougall, This is special live coverage of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City. Today, I'm Mary Lou Finley.
And I'm Rick McInnes Ray. Thank you for joining us. Please stand by. We'll be back in just a second.
I decided.
Explosions have rocked the capital of Afghanistan, but the U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld says they are not an American strike in retaliation for the terrorist attacks on the United States. Good evening, I'm Rick McInnes Ray with Mary Lou Finley. Thank you for joining us for ongoing live coverage of events in the World Trade Center in New York today and the Pentagon in Washington. In 2 hours' time, President George W. Bush will give a detailed, televised address. His spokesman says he'll give a message of resolve and reassurance. Bush has vowed to find the people behind the attacks. The president is quoted as saying, "They will suffer the consequences of taking on the U.S. We will do what it takes." Well, while the world wonders who could have caused this kind of devastation, a counterterrorism specialist at McGill University, Rex Brynan, is speculating that the finger is pointing towards Osama bin Laden.
There's a fairly lengthy list of people who might like to do this. I think the speculation that it might be Osama bin Laden is probably the best guess at this point as to who's responsible. It certainly bears many of the hallmarks of his kind of operation, the simultaneous targeting of two places, Washington, New York. It's similar in some ways to the targeting of two U.S. embassies in Africa. So bin Laden has shown a lot of cleverness, a lot of ability to protect information security within his organization. So I think he's the leading contender, but he's not necessarily the only contender, nor is it impossible that it's a new network one we haven't previously heard of, and in a sense was under the radar screen from an intelligence point of view.
However, no one has claimed responsibility for the attacks, nor has the U.S. stated just who the suspects might be. There have been numerous reports today of passengers on board the hijacked airliners calling for help on their cell phones. One of those who called out was Barbara Olson, the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. She was on a jet that crashed into the Pentagon. CNN's Tim O'Brien picks up the story.
Our understanding is that Barbara Olson was on the plane, a frequent commentator on CNN and the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson. She called her husband twice during the hijacking to tell him the plane had been hijacked, and they lost contact once, and she called back. After the first call, Olson called the command center at the Justice Department to inform them of this hijacking, and they said they knew nothing about it but would track it down.
We're going to break now for a few moments, but please join us again in 3 minutes after local news.
Radio Canada International, Canada's voice to the world. Broadcasting to the United States on 6175, 9590, 9755, 13670, and 17695 kilohertz. Coming up, Part 2 of As It Happens from CBC Radio.
Hello, I'm Rick McInnes-Ray with Mary Lou Finley, and you're listening to continuing live coverage of the suicide bombings in the United States today. Mary Lou, you have a guest on the line from the U.S.
Yes, former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger under the Ronald Reagan administration. Mr. Weinberger, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
You're in Washington or New York?
Yeah, I'm in Washington.
Where were you when you discovered what had happened today?
Well, I was I just went over to my Forbes office, and prior to that time, I had been in the doctor's office, and the reports started coming in there on the television.
And your reaction?
Well, my reaction is it's obviously the same as everybody else. It's a horrible tragedy, and it's an act of war against the country, and it's one that has caused enormous casualties, and one that needs to be avenged and react to very, very quickly. Just as soon as we find out who did it, who's guilty, then we should punish them with every lethal weapon we have at our disposal.
Secretary Weinberger, as far as we've been able to determine today, there was no warning or not enough of a warning, certainly with regard to any possible target.
That's my understanding, that it's just right out of the blue, like Pearl Harbor, and of course the difference is there that we knew who was the guilty parties. We could actually see them, but here we don't know yet. But we have to make every effort to find that out just as quickly as we can, and when we do, to act on it at once and not be tied down by any squeamish notion of whether we're overreacting or any nonsense of that kind.
Well, tell me what kind of reaction you think is appropriate.
Well, I think killing the people who did it as quickly as you possibly can.
And do you have any idea about who those people might be?
No, I do not. We have all kinds of theories and rumors and everything floating around. I do not have the knowledge. I don't have access to the intelligence information that I used to many years ago when I was secretary. But there are one thing that's going to narrow the search down is that this was an unprecedentedly wide and strong conspiracy to be able to put all this together, to have all of these planes hijacked at just about the same time by and flown by kamikaze pilots who were perfectly willing to go on a suicide mission, the way the bombers were of the Marine barracks in Lebanon a few years ago, and all of that had to be organized by some large and strong group, and for that reason I think it may be somewhat easier.
You said earlier today that $20 billion in defense spending isn't enough, but how is it possible to defend against acts like this?
Well, you have to do things that we have not been willing to do in the past in many cases, and that is to develop and deploy first of all, missile defenses, which we need very strongly for attacks of this kind, because they can come from other places than just suicide planes. And the other thing you need to do is to develop an intelligence capability that enables us to penetrate these organizations, to find out what they're planning to do and to know about it ahead of time. And you do that through carefully trained people. It takes years to train them, unfortunately, and we have deprived ourselves of this capability because a few years ago there was a big outcry that this was a very dirty business and you couldn't have spies in a democracy and a lot of nonsense like that. If democracies want to stay democracies, they have to have eyes and ears, and in this kind of a world, that's the only way you get them.
Is it your understanding that the United States would not have secret operatives working or close to
Would
inside?
not have what? I'm sorry. Would not have what?
Would not have operatives inside terrorist
Well,
organizations?
unfortunately, it is possible we would not. It's very hard to do, and we have deliberately followed a policy until recently, not recently, fortunately, but in the past, of not having human intelligence spies inside these organizations. It's very hard to recruit them. It's very hard to train them, and we have not been willing to devote resources to this kind of thing. We have a lot of money going to intelligence capabilities, and that's overhead intelligence gathering, the satellites and the things of that kind. And we could look down and see what a number of people are doing, but you can't look underground. And things like this can be hidden. And we need to have people who can penetrate these organizations, and frankly, we don't have nearly enough of it right now.
Well, which is more important then, better intelligence or a missile defense plan? Because surely this is clear evidence that you don't need to build a nuclear warhead to cause havoc and terrible destruction.
That is true, you don't. But on the other hand, people have nuclear warheads which can cause even worse destruction. I think you have to plan and try to defend against both. I don't think it's enough to say you don't need missile defense because somebody can kill you by some other means. I think you have to realize that missiles can do an enormous amount of damage from quite many thousands of miles away, and they can do it very quickly. And that for a country such as the United States that has no defense whatever against these missiles, it's a standing invitation to madmen like the people who perpetrated these activities today. So you need both. You need to have a considerably increased surveillance and attempts to get warnings and information about these events of this kind, so if they don't come out of the blue as they did at Pearl Harbor, but that you have some kind of warning if you can. But you also need the missile defense because that's another open invitation to countries that want to do this.
There is no indication at this time that the people who hijacked the airplanes and caused this destruction came from outside the United States, but there has been talk in the past about porous borders between Canada and the United States, and would-be terrorists, alleged would-be terrorists, have been caught crossing the border from Canada and the United States?
Well, I wouldn't pinpoint Canada at all. I mean, we have porous borders by design, and it's by our intention. We want to be an open country. We always have been. And we have, therefore, always the possibility that very undesirable people can come in from a number of different crossing points and can cause, as we've seen today, enormous damage.
My question was going to be whether or not you thought the borders were going to get much tighter.
Well, I'm afraid they will, yes. I'm afraid it's not just with Canada. It's not a reflection on Canada or anything of that kind, but it's just they're going to be imposed, I think, a lot more severe security measures for a time during the period of the worst of the airplane hijacking some years ago, when the metal detectors and all of that were first instituted. People resented it very much, and I'm afraid there will be the same kinds of reaction. But for a while, at least, increased security, I think, will be the order of the day.
Mr. Weinberger, did you have friends in the World Trade Center today?
I did not personally know. I mean, I'm sure that I knew some of the people working there because we had a lot of, there are an enormous number of very large companies, the Morgan Stanley and a number of very large other companies had representatives there. I have not heard yet, but I'm sure that ultimately we will find that was the case. So the loss of life there is absolutely unbelievable. This is more than perhaps we lost in the Korean War, all in an hour, less than an hour, and so we can't minimize the really horrible nature or the extent of the terrible damage that's been done.
Mr. Weinberger, thank you so much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you.
Good night. Caspar Weinberger, former Secretary of Defense under President Ronald Reagan.
We want to remind you now of the scene at the center of our live coverage here on CBC Radio 1. Frank Koller is, if not very near, in New York City now. Frank, are you hearing me?
I am, Rick. Good evening. I'm standing at the dock at the foot of 2nd Street in Jersey City, and the site of what was once the World Trade Center is probably less than a kilometer just across the water from me right now. It's on a warm, sunny summer or fall evening. To look at this billowing smoke just filling the sky is really surreal, not to be a little obvious about this. There's an increase of smoke now coming out from the ground, the bottom levels just of Manhattan. Where I'm standing, I can see water being poured on, but of course the water is maybe shooting up 8 or 10 floors, and the smoke, let alone the buildings, go up another 800-900 feet. The most amazing thing, actually, apart from the smoke, is how quiet everything is. As you know, air traffic has been shut down all over the United States, and for those of you who've ever seen pictures of New York or been here many times, you know that the skies here are just a constant burr of small planes and helicopters. There's absolutely nothing flying over New York tonight.
Frank, you had to drive from Washington to New York to witness this, so planes, of course, were grounded. And I'm wondering, I mean, were there scenes of panic or chaos? Were people driving madly out of the city? What was the
Absolutely not, Rick. It was, you know, in fact, that was reassuring to see. There, of course, were terrible traffic jams getting into the city, or people getting out of the city, and it was quite difficult getting in. I had to walk the last few miles just to get down to the waterfront here. But there was no sense of panic. I'm sure that perhaps passed this morning. It's very quiet, actually. There's several hundred people in the dock here standing looking over the river here. A few people are taking pictures, but everybody is very quiet. And as I say, the stillness here and the stillness walking through the streets of Jersey City was really quite remarkable.
What are people saying, Frank? What are they saying?
People here, where I am standing, are mostly people who were either trying to get into the city and have now been stuck here overnight in the many hotels here in Jersey City. People are just talking about their experiences during the day. A few people obviously talking about their similar travel horrors, but most people are chatting to each other, wondering if they, you know, if the neighbor standing beside them knew somebody that was in the city or knew somebody that was able to get out. People are wondering about how they're going to continue their life tomorrow, whether they're going to be able to get into work. Two young college students standing beside me a few moments ago were trying to figure out if, in fact, they were students at Columbia. They were trying to figure out if the university was closed or whether they should go 20 or 30 miles north of the city and try to work their way back down. And that's what people are consumed with, trying to just figure out what this means for this city.
And is the grit, the ash still falling, Frank?
It is not where I am because the wind is blowing from my back, but you can see there's the most amazing, huge, dark, gray-black clouds absolutely filling all of southern Manhattan, and as I look south here, south up towards the Atlantic Ocean, and it just disappears beyond the horizon. And I saw this cloud probably 40 miles from New York as we drove in this afternoon.
Thank you, Frank.
Okay, Rick.
Frank Koller, overlooking the ruins of the World Trade Center.
Rick, Christopher Marquet is the Senior Managing Director at Kroll, the risk consulting company based in Boston. He consults with airports across the country and puts out publications on travel security. Mr. Marquet, are you in Boston now?
Yes, Mary Lou. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Let me put to you the question everybody wants to know the answer to tonight. How did those people get on the airplanes?
I can't answer that. Obviously, that is the $64,000 question. And clearly, there's going to be a lot of thinking and review as to and trying to unravel how that, in fact, did occur. But there are probably quite a few scenarios. Clearly, it's the planning that went into this and the rehearsals that must have taken place, the way that the security at the airports, 3 different airports, were circumvented must have been significant. And it's not to say that clearly the security at these airports didn't stop the hijackings, and that was a critical point. We also had issues with intelligence and understanding that this was coming on to begin with. Security is really a multi-layered function, and it starts with out in the field on the ground and understanding what's going on. I don't know that we'll know for some time.
We were told one of the things that has puzzled me, one of the many things that has puzzled me today, was that there's been some mention throughout the day about a worldwide caution having been put out by the United States government a few days ago. Who does this caution go to? Who does it reach? Who hears about it? Would the airports have known?
Well, yes, the United States State Department puts out regular travel warnings and cautions and consular sheets on issues around the world, and that's something that gets picked up by the airlines, by the travel industry, by companies, and by security departments within companies, and that sort of thing.
So people should have been on the alert?
There are alerts at any given moment for lots of different places all the time. The Canadian government does the same thing. The British government does the same thing. There are warnings that are going on all the time about travel to certain places, but no warning that the attack necessarily was going to be directed at targets within the United States imminently. There have been warnings about potential attacks on U.S. interests overseas, and that goes on regularly. So it's unclear, how, what was known at the time. Clearly, the intelligence, if there was any, wasn't at a critical point, confirmed well enough, if they had any, that an attack was imminent here in the United States.
Do you assume that the hijackers had weapons, and what kind of weapons?
They had to have some, I mean, again, this gets into the sophistication and the planning and the process that they must have taken. They had to have some way of gaining control of the aircraft. The pilots themselves, some of whom were military trained, in my view, my opinion, there's no way they would have piloted those planes into the buildings. Perhaps the one that crashed outside of Pennsylvania, the pilot refused and took it down himself.
So they would have had to be disabled or killed
They
first?
would have had to be disabled in some fashion, and whoever did this, would have had, in my view, again, would have had to have some ability to handle the plane. So again, sophistication, planning, their own training that went into this, the determination was quite significant.
And how many people would it take to take over a Boeing 767 like that?
It's hard to say. It could have been one. I mean, there have been cases where a single individual's gone in and been able to smuggle a gun on board and take control of the plane. It could have been several. And my guess here is at least one, maybe two, possibly even three. But that's pure speculation. It's very hard to say at this early juncture how it could have happened. But in my view, they had to have some kind of weapon or some ability to disable the pilots, to gain access to the cockpit, and to gain control of the aircraft.
If they were guns, would they have come on with the passenger in the kitchen, in the galleys, in the baggage compartment? Did they have access to the baggage compartment from the cabin?
It could be any of those scenarios. It could have been, we don't know, was it a baggage handler who had been in place for the last year and a half, who's been planning this for the last year and a half and been waiting for the get-go, was able to smuggle in a weapon and place it on an aircraft as designated in some way. It could be many different ways that this could have happened. Less likely that it was somebody that went straight through, in my view, straight through the security at the airport as a passenger.
This is your business, consulting on security. How many close calls have you had? How many people have you taken off airplanes or caught trying to get on with weapons?
Well, we're not the government. We're a private security consulting firm, and there are lots of cases where plots are foiled, or there are deranged people who get on planes, and there are instances where people bring on, or try to bring on a weapon that they get stopped at the gate. There are cases like that happen all the time, and you don't hear about that a lot. Most of that's really unreported. What we've got to do is focus and review the security. Obviously, in the short term, it's going to be extremely high security at all transit points, whether it be airports, train stations, bus stations, terminals, tunnels and bridges, etc. Throughout the United States, and I suspect throughout the Western world.
What's security going to be like when the airports reopen tomorrow or
It's going
whenever
to
they
be
do?
a heck of a lot tighter. You're going to see physical presence of personnel. You're going to see more checking and more stringent levels of checking people coming in and out of the airports. I imagine there's going to be a review of all airport personnel. Who are they? And doing more detailed background checks and that sort of thing.
But it's too late.
There's going to be a lot of soul searching.
All right, Mr. Marquet, thank you very much for talking to us.
Sure.
Good night.
Anytime, Marilyn.
Christopher Marquet is Senior Managing Director of Kroll, which is a risk consulting company in Boston, Massachusetts. Rick?
Well, from, I guess, the politics of speculation to the politics of reassurance and anger now. In Washington, our correspondent Laura Lynch joins me. Laura, we've seen the House Speaker on his feet, the U.S. Attorney General. It looks like the White House media machine is rolling up to speed. George Bush shortly. Where is Bush, by the way?
He is at the White House. He returned to the White House about half an hour ago and went straight to the Oval Office. He is expected to address the nation in just a little over an hour from now. But as you said, the politicians are starting to emerge from their security cocoon. They are emerging united with one voice to try to tell the American people that they are together on this, that they are that amidst all of this grief, that the disbelief, the sadness, there is a growing call for retaliation and retribution. Bush himself is using those kinds of terms, apparently telling reporters who were traveling with him that the United States will find the people responsible and they will suffer the consequences. Shortly after that, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, appeared before reporters to issue the same sort of sentiments and was joined by the Joint Chiefs of the Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Henry Shelton, who said much the same thing. The two senators who are the ranking members of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, Carl Levin, a Democrat, John Warner, a Republican, to again mount their line front and say they will go after whoever is responsible for this and that they are solid behind the president. What was interesting, though, in what Rumsfeld said was actually more what he didn't say. He would not say whether they were warned in advance of this attack. He would not say what the response would be. He would not comment on reports that Osama bin Laden is behind this attack. But there is certainly the undercurrent that there is going to be some sort of retaliation, and everyone is now waiting to hear what the president will have to say in just over an hour.
That's right. We were now seeing he's moved his statement up to 8:30 Eastern Time, just a few minutes over an hour from now.
Yes.
Well, what kind of things does he have to say, and will anybody stand against him if he comes out, sort of literally, well, not literally guns blazing, but if he comes out with that kind of an enormous...
I think that clearly the political leadership in Washington is already solidly behind him on behalf of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, and that's very typical in the United States, that in times of crisis the parties come together very solidly behind the commander-in-chief. They will not break ranks over this. I doubt you will hear any words of dissonance from people there. And as you and I are speaking, you see all the members on the television, you see all members of Congress united together in prayer, united with one message, and one message that is behind the president and whatever action that he chooses to take. And I don't think, at least in these first few hours following what happened this morning, you will hear anyone criticizing what he has to say or what he chooses to do. Those kinds of things perhaps will come in days and weeks ahead as people start to sift through this and try to assign blame for what happened and try to find out if anyone really is at fault for letting this happen in the first place.
What kind of options are they talking about in Washington that the president has to use if they ever find out who to use them against?
Well, clearly they are talking about military options. Clearly they are talking about some form of serious retaliation. But you're right. The big question is who is responsible for this. And when Donald Rumsfeld was asked about the explosions in Kabul, as you know, he denied that the United States has anything to do with those explosions. People automatically thought it was the United States retaliating because that is where Osama bin Laden is believed to be. So it is thought that once they do determine who is responsible, that they will retaliate.
Thank you, Laura. Laura Lynch in Washington, our correspondent there. We are going to take a brief break now in our live coverage of the events in the U.S. Please stand by. We'll be right back.
I'm Mary Lou Finley with Rick McInnes-Ray. Welcome back to our continuing coverage of the suicide bombing attacks on the World Trade Center today in New York City and at the Pentagon in Washington.
Let's just bring you up to date quickly here. U.S. President George W. Bush has vowed to find the terrorists behind the suicide plane attacks which have destroyed the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York and caused extensive damage to part of the Pentagon. Now, the President's going to make a televised address in just under an hour, pardon me, at 9 Eastern Time. And Hugh Shelton, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was part of a news briefing given earlier this evening by senior U.S. military and defense officials. He had this to say.
We have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people. Acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Hugh Shelton. And just to be clear, the President's news conference will be at 8:30 Eastern Time, just under an hour from now. The U.S. Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, was also at the briefing earlier, and he says the U.S. is in no way connected to the explosions which rocked the capital of Afghanistan tonight. Rumsfeld made a point of noting the news briefing was being held at the Pentagon, even though the building had been the target of one of the suicide attacks. He was at the Pentagon when the hijacked plane slammed into it and describes what he saw.
I felt the shock of the airplane hitting the building, went through the building and then out into the area, and they were bringing bodies out that had been injured, most of which were alive and moving, but seriously injured. And a lot of volunteers were doing a terrific job helping to bring them out of the buildings and get them into stretchers and into ambulances and into airlifts.
Rumsfeld says that because of the extent of the damage, it's impossible to know yet how many people died in the attack on the U.S. military headquarters. Now in New York, rescue efforts are continuing amid scenes described as a nightmare. A convoy of trucks and ambulances with about 120 doctors has been sent to the ruins of the World Trade Center, where 3 buildings are now smoking or in ash. Paramedics were told to expect a mass of bodies once the smoke clears. And we have an update on the earlier reports from Whitehorse in the Yukon. A Korean airliner was forced to land at the Whitehorse Airport by U.S. military planes. The governor of Alaska says a signal from the plane was misinterpreted, suggesting a possible hijack when there wasn't one. Many U.S. international flights were diverted to airports in Canada after the U.S. shut down its entire airline system. Canada's airline system also remains closed.
Rick, we're joined now by Frederick Clarkson, who's a writer and researcher in Massachusetts and an expert on the extreme right movement in the United States. Mr. Clarkson, I don't know where you are at the moment. Are you in Boston?
No, I'm in Northampton.
In Northampton. There has been no suggestion so far that the right is involved in this particular attack, but then nobody thought that before they discovered what had happened in Oklahoma either. However, is there any reason to believe that militant groups in the United States would ever try plan an attack like this?
Well, absolutely. I think that there are 2 very active extreme right revolutionary movements in the United States right now that have a history of terrorism of different sorts and are certainly articulate a vision for doing exactly the kinds of things that we've seen today. Not necessarily the exact modus operandi, but certainly targeting major symbolic buildings in the United States, and certainly targeting the federal government. We have a neo-Nazi movement in the United States that Tim McVeigh epitomized, and his attack on the federal building in Oklahoma City was modeled on a Nazi novel called The Turner Diaries, in which a major federal building blowing up in Washington, D.C. becomes a catalyst for a white supremacist revolution. And that book, The Turner Diaries, has served as a blueprint for neo-Nazi groups for 20 years in the United States, carry out assassinations and bank robberies and the Oklahoma City bombing. The other is the violent wing of the anti-abortion movement that goes by the name of the Army of God in the United States. Been carrying out assassinations and bombings for many years, and see the central government of the United States as apostate, having abandoned God's laws and ultimately the enemy. And, for example, Paul Hill, who shot an abortion physician in Pensacola in 1994, also advocated the formation of Christian militias and the violent overthrow of the government of the United States.
Yeah, except that the World Trade Center was not, of course, a federal building.
No, but it's like whether it's Islamic figures or the neo-Nazis or the violent wing of the Christian right in the United States, all of them would see the World Trade Centers as symbolic in one way or another of the economic side of the New World Order, and would see them as legitimate targets.
Would they have the wherewithal and the sophistication to coordinate an attack like this? It was very sophisticated.
Well, there's been a lot of talk of sophistication, but I guess I'm not as persuaded of that. If you have a long-term revolutionary view with an idea of taking out strategic targets, the kind of information that you would need about how to get access to airliners and to hijack them might involve nothing more complicated than being a part of the airline industry and working in the baggage handling section for a few years. To get access to airlines and then to be able to fly a plane, from everything that I've heard, is not necessarily the most complicated thing in the world.
And what about taking 200-odd innocent Americans with you on each attack? Don't in the planes.
Well, that's, in Tim McVeigh's words, that's collateral damage.
Considering the opprobrium that was dumped on their movements after the Oklahoma City bombing, though it's hard to believe that they would sacrifice so many American lives in their wars, whatever their cause, against the United States government.
Well, I think we could say the same for bin Laden's previous outings in terrorism as well. The opprobrium of the world and even one's co-religionists isn't sufficient to overcome serious religious-based revolutionary zeal.
Wouldn't they want to take responsibility for this then, if they're trying to get out a message?
Maybe. Sometimes the message of terrorism is the unstated fear that accompanies violent acts. The ripple effect beyond the physical act of blowing up a building extends far beyond those physically affected. It changes the way people think and feel and changes their thinking and behaviors. Already today we're talking about, national figures are talking about rolling back civil liberties in the United States in order to deal with people's fear of potential terrorist acts. Not the acts that have already happened, but the ones that people fear might be coming in the future.
All right, Mr. Clarkson, thank you very much for talking to us.
You're welcome.
Good evening. Frederick Clarkson is a writer and researcher and author of a book called Eternal Hostility about the Far Right in America. We spoke to him in Northampton, Massachusetts.
Well, if you thought you were going to fly in Canada tonight, you won't. As a security precaution, air travel across the country has pretty much come to a standstill following the attacks in the U.S. Well, the flights bound for the U.S. were also being diverted to Canadian airports today. And that's left tens of thousands of passengers stranded across the country. Our national reporter, Maureen Brosnan, is here to bring us up to date on the impact of all these disruptions. So, Maureen, do we know just how many U.S.-bound flights ended up coming to Canada?
Well, we don't have an exact number, but an estimated 500 are expected to land in Canada or have already landed during the course of this day. Starting out on the east coast in Newfoundland, about 45 planes had already landed in Gander, which of course has a huge international airport. About 30 others have landed in St. John's and several more in Stephenville and Goose Bay in Labrador. Halifax has already received more than 24 and is expecting at least another 10, and at least 10 have even arrived in Moncton, New Brunswick. Here in central Canada, Pearson International Airport is expected to handle another 25, and out in western Canada, Winnipeg, Edmonton, and Vancouver are also handling dozens of American-bound flights. And several have even landed in the far north, as you know, mentioning the Korean airliner in Whitehorse. Now, NAVCAN, which is the company that runs air traffic control at airports across Canada, has brought in at least 100 extra air traffic controllers to try to handle the work.
What an incredible burden. What are the implications of all of this?
Well, it means tens of thousands of passengers are being stranded right across the country. Special arrangements have been made in many communities to find accommodations for the passengers. Hotels, rooms, stadiums, military bases are all chipping in to help, as are local caterers and restaurants. So the situation is, very much community by community. The problem is that phone lines are jammed in many parts of the country today, as was the internet, as people tried frantically to get information about the disaster on the flights, on people who were on the flights, and people were being asked not to tie up the lines unless it was absolutely essential. Now, apparently the Canadian Red Cross is now setting up a registry for passengers and crews from the diverted flights. And once the registry is set up, friends and families of the stranded passengers will be able to contact the Red Cross to find out where their folks are.
But in the meantime, they've got to be looking for other ways to get where they want to go. Are there any other alternate means of transportation out there?
Not a whole lot. Passenger train travel from Canada to the U.S. was suspended today. Buses are still running as far as we know, but there are long lineups at the borders where the security remains on high alert. Everyone is being checked and their ID is being verified. Car rentals are also at a premium. They only had a few minivans left when I was out at Pearson Airport late this afternoon, and I think the same is here in the Toronto area. But the problem is the car rental companies will not allow one-way rentals, which means you can't pick up a car here and drop it off someplace else, say over the border or that, so you're kind of stuck.
Of course.
And out on the west coast, ferry traffic between British Columbia and Washington State was obviously delayed too because of security concerns.
So what is all this doing for the passengers' temperament?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people, especially personally when I was out at Pearson today, there was a really eerie calm about the whole place. I think people were very numbed, they're bewildered, especially the Americans, and I think a lot of them are just pretty glad to be on the ground. There wasn't really much panic, just a very tired acceptance. I think the thing that was so strange was that usually when there are big holdups at airports or major weather problems or that, you see tons of bodies lying around on the chairs. There wasn't any of that. The airport was almost empty. People were just wanting to get out of there. I think a lot of people were even frightened to be at the airport. So many were booking hotel rooms. Airport hotels were full, but people were finding accommodations with the help of airline and airport staff. There were also several Good Samaritans who came out to offer help, not only at Pearson, but right across the country, offering to billet people in their homes until things get back to some semblance of normality.
We've heard a lot of stories about community spirit, but aside from looking after these people and getting them on their way, the airport still have to worry about security. What's it like for most time?
Well, it's pretty much on high alert. It was very clear this afternoon that people, police and airport authorities wanted to clear the airport as much as possible, and people were being advised to stay away unless they need to be at the airport. In some parts of the country, RCMP were actually setting up roadblocks and trying to prevent people from going to them. So police are basically staying on top of this, trying to bring in extra security, searching the airports obviously, so things are going to stay on high alert for quite a while.
Maureen Brosnan, a national reporter in Toronto, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Rick.
We're joining Anthony Germain now in Ottawa, I hope. Anthony, are you there?
Actually, Mary Lou, it's Dave Taylor here. Anthony is back on the desk chasing stuff down.
All right. Hello, Dave.
Hello.
Now, does all of this closure of airports mean that those cabinet members who are out of Ottawa are not going to be able to get in today?
Well, the one minister in particular who was trying to get back home today was the Foreign Affairs Minister, John Manley. He was on a trip to Europe this week, flying back today. As of our last conversation with his office, they had not found him back on the ground in Canada. Several ministers, several important ministers for this story are away, the most two significant being Mr. Manley and the Defense Minister, Art Eggleton, both of whom are away, and in the words of the Prime Minister's office, are in easy contact with the PMO. So from the point of view of the Prime Minister's office, the ministers may be out of sight, but certainly not out of contact.
So what is happening there at the moment?
Well, if you're a tourist walking up on Parliament Hill tonight and it was a spectacular sunset behind the center block, you would have looked up at the Peace Tower and seen the Canadian flag that flies there at half-staff. And I guess that's symbolic of the feeling in the city today. the Prime Minister found out about this morning during a breakfast meeting with the Saskatchewan Premier Lorne Calvert at 24 Sussex. One of his aides sort of tapped him on the shoulder, let him know that the fairly serious incident had occurred in the United States, and that prompted a written statement from the Prime Minister's office this morning, followed up by a brief scrum with reporters this afternoon in the foyer of the House of Commons. Let's listen to a bit of that right now.
I don't think that we have seen anything as horrible as what happened this morning. For the security, I have been in touch with the ministers and with the head of the agencies to make sure that everything was to remain secure, and we said to everybody to remain calm. I hope that Canadians will show their solidarity with our neighbors, and the news to come when we discover the number of people who died will be probably very tragic.
Dave, we're just getting news, in fact, that among the dead are at least 200 firefighters and 78 New York Police Department officers. Obviously, there are hundreds of others.
Well, I think we'll be adding zeros to those numbers as the days go by. It's just a breathtaking event. As far as the government is concerned, meetings throughout the day, particularly a major meeting this morning among the sort of the prime ministries here, meaning the PMO, Defense, Foreign Affairs, also the main agencies, as the Prime Minister mentioned, CSIS, the RCMP. The Foreign Affairs Ministry has put up a 1-800 number for Canadians wanting to find out about friends and relatives in the New York and Washington areas. That number, I'll just give that out now, is 1-800-387-3124. And I can attest to myself here. My brother lives in Brooklyn. I was trying to reach him earlier tonight, and there's just no way you can get through. So good advice to call that number, 1-800-387-3124. The other angle on this story, and your conversation with Maureen Brosnan certainly brings that home, is that Canada has become something of a large, I guess, runway for returning largely American-bound aircraft. And we're waiting for a statement tonight from David Collinette, the Transport Minister, bringing us up to date on the status of that operation and what's going to happen in the coming days. Interestingly, we heard about 45 minutes ago in a news conference in Washington from Norman Mineta, who's the U.S. Transportation Secretary, and he had some kind words for Canada there.
We have already taken some first steps as a precaution. I have ordered the FAA to ground all commercial air traffic until at least tomorrow afternoon. After the attack, some of our aircraft were diverted to Canada. And so we owe our Canadian neighbors a debt of gratitude for helping us as we redirected over 120 flights and their passengers to airports in Canada.
Dave, I don't know if you've been able to get outside at all. Do you know what the scene is like around the U.S. Embassy on Sussex Drive in Ottawa, the building that was really just completed only a few months ago?
Well, the scene in the whole downtown of Ottawa, Mary Lou, today was a bit peculiar. You know, there was no state of emergency declared in any of the parliamentary buildings. There was a very brief bomb scare this morning that prompted the evacuation of a couple of buildings, the East Block and the west wing of the Chateau Laurier. Staff at the U.S. Embassy were allowed to leave early, and there was a heightened, although certainly not oppressive, police presence in the downtown. Shops, restaurants, stores and things, again in sort of the immediate parliamentary precinct, where people were just sort of closing up shop early because there wasn't a whole lot of business. And if, say, you work for an MP or a senator, the advice was, well, you know, you might as well just go home, and that is what most people did. So in fact it was a very quiet day. And interestingly, sort of adding to the quiet, I suppose, was that today there was another one of these wildcat strikes by members of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. So driving into work this morning, you know, I was driving past picket lines, which gradually dried up through the morning as PSAC pulled their pickets down and just acknowledging that this was not an appropriate thing to be doing on a day like this. Mary Lou, I just want to bring you up to date on one thing here. We have the statement from Minister Collinette, and it's just passed to me here right now. Trying to get the details here. It's about a page long, so forgive me for a moment for just reading through it. It says here, at approximately 10 o'clock this morning, the Government of Canada declared that no further aircraft, commercial or private, would be allowed to depart Canadian airports until further notice. The only exceptions to this declaration were military, police, or humanitarian flights. At the same time, the Canadian aviation system began preparations to accept flights previously destined for the U.S. that could no longer land in that country. At the time of the terrorist incidents at the U.S., approximately 500 aircraft were en route to North American airports. Approximately half of these returned to their points of departure, with the remaining aircraft continuing on to Canadian destinations. So, you know, if we want to parse numbers here, about 250 then. As of 6 p.m. Eastern, more than 200 aircraft had landed at various airports across the country. All of the relevant agencies, including NAV Canada, the FAA in the U.S., and authorities at various Canadian airports have exhibited a high level of cooperation. Just to give you some numbers here, international flights have been diverted to more than a dozen Canadian airports. 44 to Halifax, 37 to Gander, 35 to Vancouver, 27 to St. John's. We've heard from Maureen Brosnan about activity in Toronto. So that about sums it up as far as air travel goes.
Dave, it sounds from that statement as though the reason that traffic or departures were halted across Canada was not as people might have suspected early on, for reasons of fear or security, but in order to allow all this unexpected traffic to arrive, to make the airport, to leave the airports clear for them. Is that possible?
Well, it's an awful lot of unscheduled business, and one would have to assume that you know, what mattered most to those in the business of making sure airplanes land and take off safely is that in the absence of all those airports in the United States, you better bring those planes home safely. And I think that would be a fair assumption to make at this point.
Yeah, plus the fact that I suppose a huge number of the airplanes that do leave Canada are headed for the United States, and they weren't going anywhere.
Exactly.
Have there been any other official statements or statements from members of the government or the opposition during the day?
There have been statements of condolence from all of the opposition leaders. Gilles Duceppe, Stockwell Day, Joe Clark, Alexa McDonough have all issued statements acknowledging their, you know, what's obvious. I mean, the horror of what they saw going on in New York and Arlington today. We also had a briefing this afternoon, late in the afternoon, with the Commissioner of the RCMP, Giuliano Zaccardelli, and he talked about the nature of the security operations in a fairly broad way going on in Canada right now. Let's hear a bit from him.
We instituted a number of measures to protect the citizens of this country, certain institutions, certain buildings, and certain people that are potentially at higher risk. That's what we have done.
Okay, and one other agency of note here, Mary Lou. Late this afternoon, the Bank of Canada issued a statement saying that it would ensure that the country's financial system would have sufficient liquidity to support the stability of the Canadian financial system and the functioning of the financial markets, I guess in anticipation of a rather down open in the event the markets open up in Canada tomorrow. I've noticed on the wires that it looks like the New York markets will be closed for stock trading and bond trading tomorrow. But it's one of those things that go out, I suppose, in times of trouble from you know, agencies such as the Bank of Canada, just to remind Canadians that, you know, they're keeping an eye on things.
Dave, back to the RCMP commissioner. Did he say anything about any threat, implied or explicit, to Canada or to targets in Canada?
No, he didn't. And Mr. Zaccardelli was very careful to you know, keep his words as vague as possible. You know, the kind of language, for instance, that we're hearing from American officials tonight. Well, you know, I'm not going to talk about that, or you know, I'm not going to answer those sorts of questions. The commissioner was, you know, saying the same sorts of things. So again, you sort of have to wonder in light of things, for instance, the Ahmed Rassam incident at West, the degree of cooperation that's underway currently between the
Radio Canada International.
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 Radio Canada International.